So tomorrow, as Trudy says, the Liberal Party will hold a caucus meeting to discuss tonight's decision, if any, and then maybe vote themselves on whether a net zero by 2050 policy will be taken to the COP26 climate conference in Glasgow next month. But what does the government's change of heart over climate change action really mean for this country? We may be on the brink of a target commitment, but what does it mean? Now, there's no plan on the table. The public can't look at a plan. There are no costings, which became a central point at the last federal election. The Daily Telegraph's Joe Hildebrand has been writing a series of articles in an attempt to explain the investment opportunities which may lie ahead of us once we embrace a more renewable energy future. As one of those people who engineered a series of anti-carbon tax rallies 10 years ago, I'm yet to be convinced. But I am a good listener, Joe. Good evening.
G'day, Chris. How are you, mate?
I'm very well. What might we be buying into here? Insecure power supply, higher power prices and costly subsidies?
Yeah, those are all very valid concerns, although it seems as though, in a sense, capitalism has conquered climate change. The advancements, the innovation, the competition that has driven that innovation and advancements has largely eliminated some of those concerns. There are, of course, some that still remain. But there does seem to be a very bright future for Australia in a net zero economy. And I suppose the rub is that whether or not we embrace it, that's the direction the rest of the world is going in. So it's a train that's leaving the station, whether we like it or not. The only question is whether or not Australia gets on board.
All right, if we're all in the same flat tax bracket, I'm not talking about literally a tax, but I'm talking about net zero by 2050.
Yeah.
Some of us are not high emitters. Whether you argue that Australia is or not, put that aside. But some nations are not high emitters. They'll be under the same force of by 2050 get to net zero, but so will other countries who are high emitters. How is that fair?
Yeah, well, look, you make an excellent point. I mean, you've got major developing countries of 1 billion people or more, like China and India, obviously, who have not signed up to the same net 2050 target. They're still on net 2060. And that, in a sense, is not really an economic argument or an environmental one. It's a kind of fairness one. It's a kind of, well, we develop faster and the first world needs to sort of make allowances for the developing world. And you can argue that that's not fair. And in a sense, it's not. But it's something that we, I suppose, have acknowledged and said, well, look, as you're trying to get your people from, and this is an advertisement, if you like, for fossil fuels, for coal-fired power stations. If you're trying to get your people out of poverty and into the middle class at this massive rate, as we've seen, for example, in China, this, taking a peasant agrarian economy into a middle-class urban economy, that requires huge amounts of power. And I suppose the global consensus is, well, we accept that that's going to take a little bit longer, and it's not really fair to put the same amount of pressure on those kinds of economies as it is on first world economies, where we actually can transition, to use that terribly overused cliched word, to clean power and actually be economically better off. And from what I've seen, just having my head buried in this stuff over the past 3 months or so, there is actually a really powerful economic argument that Australia can be not just no worse off in a net zero economy, but actually far, far better off, and that we are uniquely geographically and economically blessed by the other minerals we have in the ground beneath our feet to be able to generate the sort of things that the world is going to need for a long, long time to come. And that might be critical minerals like cobalt and nickel or copper, or it might be, for example, wind and solar. We know we've got very large, dry, hot spaces in our continent that, and we've got very windy spaces in our continent that can generate all this stuff.
And if we rely on the technology improving and battery storage improving, which you can only presume will happen. I don't know how long, no one really knows, but if that improves and we can turn to other minerals for energy, and we do, put our R&D into new technologies, I can see us finding alternatives. But we're not going to save the planet from Australia, are we, Joe? Because the former chief scientist always said to us, we could cut off the carbon industry right tomorrow and we make no difference to the temperature of the planet.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. I mean, part of it is an exercise in goodwill. And I suppose part of what we've been doing with the Mission Zero campaign throughout all News Corp metro mastheads, is been trying to sort of leave the politics out of it, even leave the environmental argument out of it, to be quite frank, and just look at the economic argument, saying, look, what can Australia actually benefit from? So, as you say, there's an element of unfairness to this because we are so blessed with fossil fuels that we will be disproportionately disadvantaged, and we are, relatively small in the global scheme of things. So our emissions pale in comparison to places like China, if you're talking about in sort of gross terms, as opposed to per capita, where our very small population inflates those figures.
All right.
But regardless of all of that, there are actually huge opportunities for Australia in this new economy, and we've done, plenty of research, got plenty of figures put on the table, and especially, and this is what I think you and others, and Matt Canavan as well, who's I've been talking to a lot, and he's obviously a very hard man to turn around on this, but he's right when it comes to sticking up for regional communities. And my personal benchmark for all of this has been that it can't just be better off for Australia overall. It can't just be better off for our economy overall, even if you're talking about more jobs created than not. My position in attacking all of this has been, well, I don't care if, you can't just say, well, there's going to be 2 jobs in Adelaide created for every 1 job lodged in Gladstone or the Hunter Valley or the Latrobe Valley, all those big coal mining communities. It has to be jobs created in those centres where they are losing jobs.
Very true.
I will not. Yeah, it has to be that the coal miner, quite frankly, is our test case in this.
Exactly. I've got to leave it there, Joe. I've got to leave it there. The National Party has just broken from their meeting, and I'm going to tell people what's happened. Thank you, mate.
Great. Thank you, mate. Lovely to talk.
Joe Hildebrand.